Just because of a roof repair document, my grandmother almost lost the house she had lived in since 1979. This morning, at the Sacramento Superior Court, I stood in an emergency hearing. The courtroom was cold. The sound of pages turning was dry, like wind scraping across wood. I am Lena. At the lectern, my lawyer placed a USB drive and a notary journal. He said, "Just need to watch this recording." The screen lit up. The living room of the house in Curtis Park. Tree shadows fell through the window. My stepfather stood too close to Grandma Dot. The pen cap was already off. The house transfer deed lay waiting on the table. The notary kept her distance, her voice professional but gentle. "Can you repeat, in your own words, that a quitclaim is a document where you give up your rights to the house? And what it will do to this house?" She hesitated, her eyes drifting. I'm not sure. Is it so he can fix the roof?" My stepfather cut in, urging, "Just one signature and it's done. We're family." The notary did not budge. "I need to hear you explain it yourself. If you can't express it, I can't proceed." She grew even more confused. Then the final line dropped, small but definitive. "I refuse to notarize. No fingerprint in the journal, no entry. Today, here, there will be no notarization for this document." I thought that meant we were safe. But 2 days later, a quitclaim still showed up at the recorder's office. The notary acknowledgement used an expired commission number. The stamp was crooked. The font on the seal didn't match. The judge asked in a low voice, "What is the plaintiff requesting?" My lawyer answered succinctly, "Freeze all transactions related to the house. Appoint independent counsel for Ms. Dot. Set a hearing for an injunction. Temporarily void the suspected forged document." My stepfather stammered, "I just wanted to fix the roof." I looked straight ahead, saying clearly in my head, "No one fixes a roof by forcing an elderly person to sign papers. No one calls that family when they are afraid of the camera and afraid of the notary journal." The judge nodded slightly. "The court has heard. The court will issue a temporary order this morning." The body cam said no. The notary journal said no. And to understand why we ended up here, we have to step back a few weeks. Back to the lemon porch in Curtis Park. That afternoon, the neighborhood breathed evenly, the wind passing through the porch like an old acquaintance. My grandmother set the teapot on the table, opened the frayed-edged album, and pointed to the picture of Tower Bridge, pale yellow in the sunlight. "I bought this house in 1979, she said, her hand gently stroking the edge of the photo. The borrowing had been paid off, no more debt, so the wind over the roof was always light, as if it knew there was no extra burden on it anymore. In the kitchen, my mother, Elaine, counted pills. I stuck the medication chart on the cabinet door. Morning, take blood pressure pills. Noon, take vitamins. Evening, take blood sugar medicine. Grandma Dot sometimes went looking for her glasses when they were right on top of her head, or asked the date again even though the calendar hung right by the door. The doctor wrote mild impairment in her chart. To me, that number wasn't a label stuck on her forehead, but like a sticky note put up for the whole family. Be less hurried, less irritable when she forgets small things. The kitchen had the creak of the electric fan, a vase of yellow chrysanthemums my mother had hastily arranged, an old radio that only picked up one oldies station. Everything spoke in the simple language of people who have stayed in one place long enough to know what grows in which season. Rick, my stepfather, walked in with a stack of home repair catalogs. He spread them out on the table like a fine plan. Replace the roof? Add heat-shielding shingles? Redo the kitchen in the farmhouse style that's trendy in Midtown. If we transfer the house into my LLC, Rick said, his voice steady like reciting a lesson, I can refinance at a good rate, get the roof fixed sooner. Everyone will live more comfortably. It's a win for the whole family. Grandma Dot gave a polite smile, nodding in that Sacramento kind of courtesy. Soft first, decision later. I looked out the window, saw the shadow of lemon leaves fall across the concrete, and remembered the other day when a mobile notary had come by the neighbor's house to sign the car sale papers. Here, people are used to a notary coming right to the house. A single signature can touch a lot of things. But a deed, meaning the ownership of a roof, is not a sheet of paper you just sign and tuck into a folder. It is a whole lifetime of someone sweeping the porch every morning. As the afternoon fell, I rode my bike around Curtis Park, listening to the slow clanging of the light rail, passing rows of pastel-painted bungalows lined up like old blush compacts. I thought about the word benefit, always shining on the lips of the grown-ups. In my own mind, though, was the word keep, small but heavy. Keep the house, keep the boundaries, keep my grandmother's voice when her memory starts to fall a step behind. I didn't want the kitchen with the vase of yellow chrysanthemums to turn into an asset line item in some company's file. I wanted it to go on being the place where she told me to add another spoonful of sugar to the tea, because if the tea is bitter, then life is bitter too. In the evening, the breeze rolled in cool. I finished folding the medication chart, latched the door, listened to the lemon leaves brushing the roof like someone whispering. Sacramento has a gentle but persistent rhythm. The delta breeze blows through. Wildflower dust clings to your hem, and the day feels a little longer because the sunlight tilts slowly. I sat beside Grandma Dot, held her hand, and spoke as if talking to myself. This house is yours, and it belongs to the memories you've put into every brick. From that day on, I decided, any document with the word deed on it, I would read more carefully, ask for the notary's name, and question every line before anyone put pen to paper. In Sacramento, being decent means doing things right, and love is keeping in the right place what deserves to be kept, especially a roof that has known its own name since 1979. 10 days before the notarization appointment, everything in the Curtis Park house started changing tempo, as if someone had sped up the tape. On the first morning, I biked home and saw an off-white sheet of paper taped right to the gate. No visitors. The letters were bold, the tape layered over the old paint. Neighbors passing by hesitated. Miss Alvarez stood outside the fence with a basket of oranges. I opened the gate to invite her in. Then Rick stepped out from the house. Another day, Dot needs to rest. I saw a flicker of disappointment in my grandmother's eyes, and then she laughed it off. The polite kind of laugh that hides a sigh. The next day, my mother Elaine gathered the mail and noticed several envelopes from the county had been redirected to a strange P.O. box. I called the information line. The person on the other end confirmed there had been a recent request to forward mail. My mother looked at me, scissors still in her hand. Why forward it? We're still here. Rick answered quickly. From now on, I'll manage the mail so it's tidier. Dot forgets things. I nodded but wrote in my notebook, County Mail, P.O. Box, like pinning a small tack into my memory. On the third day, Rick texted the family group. Shannon, notary, will swing by at 7:30 p.m. to sign papers. I looked up. 7:30 p.m. is when Dot takes her sleeping meds and watches the news, not the time to sign important documents. I replied, daylight is better, so she can read carefully. Rick dropped a thumbs-up icon, then called my mother separately. Lena is overreacting. That evening, as I set the teapot on the table, Rick handed Dot a script, a few bullet points. I understand this document. I am willing. No one is forcing me. She read slowly, sometimes mixing up words, and I saw her hand tremble. I pulled my chair closer. Grandma, a quitclaim means you give up your rights to the house. It's not a roof repair paper. Dot frowned, her fingers stopping at the words, "Give up," like someone who has just touched a hot stone. I walked around the house, opened the windows to let the Delta breeze blow in. I spoke louder than usual, as if to the whole house. If it's roof repair, we talk about title and contractors. If it's a transfer of ownership, we need explanations and time. My mother looked at Rick, flustered. Maybe we should go to the title office tomorrow and then decide? Rick snapped, his palm hitting the tabletop with a dry smack. It's just a quitclaim. It's family. The phrase, "it's family," landed right on the softest spot in my mother's heart. I saw her freeze like someone whose wrist has just been grabbed. I spoke slowly, looking straight at Rick. All the more reason family needs to go slow and be clear. In the following days, small alarms kept stacking up. The doorbell was taped over. Rick said it was, so Dot doesn't get startled. My medication schedule chart was moved to a dark corner. Shannon texted, "I only sign when the signer understands and is willing," but Rick still insisted. "She just has to answer a few questions and nod, that's it." I felt myself becoming the only one holding a slow rhythm in a house being forced to speed up. I coaxed Dot out onto the porch, opened the old album, asked her about the small crack in the hallway wall, about the lemon tree that almost fell in that big storm years ago. Every story she told was an anchor tying her to this house, so that when someone handed her a pen, she would still know where she stood. The night before the appointment, I laid the pill chart back out in the middle of the kitchen and taped up another big sheet of paper. "Don't sign if it hasn't been read and explained." My mother looked at me, eyes worried. "Are you afraid you're overdoing it?" I held her hand and spoke just loud enough. "When adults demand speed, I demand explanations. A quitclaim guarantees nothing except giving up rights. If Dot truly wants it, we'll go with her in daylight, with witnesses, with a notary who explains every line." My mother nodded, exhaled, as if she'd found something to hold on to in a rushing current. Late at night, Rick still texted, "Shannon, 7:30 p.m. tomorrow." I replied, "Daytime only." I hit send, then turned off the light and stood still in the kitchen, listening to lemon leaves scrape the roof. Sometimes protecting a roof comes down to 4 words: slow, clear, enough, light. And that night, I knew I would bring those 4 words into the living room, in front of both strangers and family, so that Sacramento's plain truth and Dot's voice wouldn't be fast-forwarded by anyone. That evening, a single word, refused, saved the whole house. The Curtis Park living room was just bright enough, like an invitation to stay calm. I opened the door for Shannon Lee to step in. She immediately set a plastic sign next to the bookshelf. "Video recording for safety. By proceeding, you consent." Then Shannon handed the consent form to Dot and Rick to sign, her explanation light but clear. "Today I will record everything to protect everyone." I saw my grandmother nod slightly, her hand trembling very faintly like a newly tightened thread. The body cam light came on, a small beep. Shannon checked Dot's ID, compared the photo, then sat opposite her, lowering herself to eye level. "Can you say again what a quitclaim is?" Dot blinked, searching for words. "Sign so Rick can fix the roof?" The answer fell onto the rug like a pebble, without being able to bounce back up. Shannon turned to Rick. "Please step back a bit so I can assess independently." Rick frowned slightly but stepped back toward the kitchen. I heard the chair scrape the floor, the Delta breeze slip through the crack in the door, and suddenly I felt grateful for that wind. It was like someone had stepped into the room and opened another window. Shannon shifted into her professional tone, each word laid down like a brick, unhurried, not choppy. "This deed transfers all rights to the house to Mr. Rick. Do you intend to keep a life estate? That is, the right to live here for the rest of your life?" Have you discussed this with a lawyer? Dot looked down at her hands. Her index finger touched the edge of the paper, then pulled back, her lips moving without forming a sentence. I could clearly see that moment of confusion. A woman who had once arranged her life so neatly, now facing a piece of paper that could rename her memories. Shannon waited, her gaze gentle but fixed on the goal. Does she understand? And is she acting voluntarily? When the silence stretched beyond a single breath, she capped her pen and said clearly, I refuse this transaction. I will write in my journal, refused, undue influence signs. She turned the body cam in a circle, bringing into frame Dot's face, the safe distance between her and Rick, and the consent sign. I stood behind the sofa and felt my shoulders drop a little, as if I had just set down a burden called peace. When Shannon left, the sky was already dark. I led Dot into her room, made her warm milk, and heard Rick open the back door and walk out into the yard. A little later, my phone buzzed with a voicemail. I listened to it. Rick's voice, lowered but still clear in every word. If she doesn't sign, everyone will lose the house when she gets sick. I stared at the flickering screen, feeling the cold seep from my heels up to the nape of my neck. I saved the voicemail, dropped it into a folder named Keep the House, then wrote another line in my notebook. Threatening loss of the house if she doesn't sign. Voicemail 2012. I didn't call back. I went to check the latches, laying my hand on each lock as if touching the house's pulse, reminding myself, slow, clear, enough, bright. 2 days later, my phone rang close to noon. Ben Ortiz from the recorder's office introduced himself, his professional voice practiced at walking between paperwork and people's emotions. A quitclaim has been recorded. Instrument CHU 2025 0xxxx. Different notary. The seal number matches a notary who is retired. I leaned against the windowsill, watching the lemon tree on the porch shake its leaves as if it had just taken a strong gust of wind. Not Shannon. Someone else had pushed the paper through the recorder's office. I asked Ben if he could hold it. He said that under procedure, once it's recorded, they need a court's direction or a written complaint with evidence of fraud. I thanked him, hung up, then called my mother, my own voice sounding strange, calm in a sharp way. Mom, another deed has slipped into the records. The line was silent for a few seconds. Then I heard her set the cup down hard onto the saucer. That evening, I replayed Shannon's body cam, fast-forwarding to the part where she asked about life estate, listening again to I refuse and the click of the pen against the journal. I copied down exactly the line she had written. Refused. Undue influence signs. I attached a photo of the consent sign, the ID she had checked, and the signed consent form. Next to that, I uploaded Rick's voicemail and noted the time. Then I opened my email and wrote to Atty, Aranda, subject line. Emergency, recorded quitclaim post-refusal, evidence attached. The body was just 5 lines. Shannon had refused. There was a journal and video. 2 days later, a quitclaim from a different notary appeared, using the seal number of a retired notary. Requesting an emergency ex parte order, Yaha temporary voiding, PUTS, elder protective order. A request for the recorder's office to place a flag. I hit send, then rested my forehead against the glass for a moment, listening to the delta breeze blow through, the scent of lemon peel drifting up and making my eyes sting. At night, I sat next to Dot and told her about the Yellow Tower Bridge back in the day, and the neighbor's cat that once fell asleep on the roof. She smiled, her eyes shining as if they had touched a piece of old sunlight. I held her hand and told myself, sometimes justice doesn't arrive with a gavel, but with hard evidence. A video saying no, a journal entry reading refused, a threatening voicemail, a seal that has been borrowed without permission. I straightened her blanket, stood up, and gathered all the papers into a red folder labeled Curtis Park. When I turned off the light, I knew the crescendo had begun. From Shannon's footage, it would rise in the courthouse hallway at the recorder, then flow into the emergency order in the judge's hand, so that a notary's "I refuse" could become a shield for an old woman who is losing a few words in her memory, but has never lost the right to live in her own house. I knew the crescendo had begun. 2 days later, a piece of paper had still slipped through the records, and the lock on the door was different. That afternoon, I was standing at the back door with a bag of groceries in my arms when I heard a strange metallic clatter. A brand new lock, gleaming, ice cold. I tried the old key and it wouldn't catch. Called Mom. The Delta breeze slipped through, making the lemon leaves knock against the roof like tapping out an impatient rhythm. Inside, someone's footsteps came to a stop. Rick opened the front door a crack, blocking it with his body. "Dot needs to rest. From now on, there are rules about coming and going. Make an appointment first." I looked over his shoulder and saw her fuzzy slippers set askew, the cup of milk still steaming. "This is her house," I said slowly. Rick curled his lip. "The papers are already signed." "Don't make this messier." The words "already signed" hit me in the chest like a stone thrown into a well that had just gone still. In my head, Shannon's body cam and the line, "refused, undue influence signs," sprang back at once. My mother Elaine ran out, eyes wet, hands still dusted with flour from cooking porridge. "Rick says she already signed." "He's my husband, Lena. Don't make things tense." I held my mother, clearly feeling her quick breaths, the smell of medicated oil on her shoulder. I wanted to argue back, to drag out all the photos, timestamps, and the voicemail right there on the doorstep. But when I glanced into the living room, I saw Dot sitting silent, her hands clasped together, her eyes blinking over and over. "Are you going to make me move out of my own house?" she asked, her voice small as mist. The question made the house suddenly feel larger and colder. The photos of Tower Bridge on the wall seemed to slide halfway out of their frames. That night, her confusion was obvious. She asked the date again and again, looked for the wallet lying right in front of her, started at the sound of the phone ringing. I laid a thin blanket over her knees and whispered, "You're in your own house." In the kitchen, the spoon clinked against the pot. My mother sat down on a chair, tears falling in streaks. "I'm afraid of legal trouble, afraid of what the neighbors will say," she said. I held my mother's hand, my heart softening and hardening at the same time. Soft because I loved her, hard because I knew that if I lost my composure now, I would lose the path forward. I stepped out onto the porch, breathed in deeply the smell of damp lemon peel and cool earth, and dialed APS. The calm voice on the hotline asked one question after another. Name, age, address, signs of coercion, change of locks, fear of being moved. I answered as if copying down a long day. The notary had refused, the recorder still had another deed, the voicemail threatening, "lose the house if she doesn't sign," and now the new lock. When I hung up, I emailed Atai. "Aranda, the situation is escalating. Please file the ex parte as soon as possible. Request an order prohibiting changes to the status quo, compelling the reopening of access, and protecting the elder." I texted Shannon to thank her for the video and to confirm she was willing to testify. I sent Ben Ortiz a request to flag the document bearing the same seal number as the retired notary. Not a single shouted word, only reports and timestamps. Late at night, I went back to the back door. The new lock still gleamed stiffly, but I didn't feel like I was standing outside. I sat with her in the living room, opened the old Sacramento album, and let her tell again the time she rode her bike across the Yellow Tower Bridge. Each story was a thread tying her here, in the house that bears her name. I laid my hand on the smooth wooden table and spoke loud enough for 3 people to hear. I choose the law, not screaming. Rick leaned against the doorway, silent. My mother wiped her eyes and breathed more deeply. Dot leaned on my shoulder and whispered, "Stay." I nodded. The Sacramento night settled slowly. The Delta breeze kept blowing, like a quiet guarantee. Some houses stand firm not because the walls are thick, but because the truth is called by its right name, and the voices of the elderly are set back into the old lock, opening from the inside, for the people who belong there. When the hand does not tell the truth, let the ink marks speak. We call it the 5-person team, but in fact it is 5 heartbeats in sync in a piece of music that is rising. Me, Attorney Aranda, Detective Alvarez, Ben at the county recorder, and Shannon, the mobile notary who said, "I refuse," right in front of me. The background music in my head is the sound of a cord being pulled tight. Each cut of a new day is a puzzle piece of evidence falling into the right place, with a small but firm click. On a light, rainy night, under yellow lights, I sat on the edge of a chair in the law office, watching Aranda type the last lines of the emergency motion, requesting a temporary restraining order for elder abuse to force Rick to move away from Dot and the assets, requesting an order freezing all transactions, mortgages, leases, or transfers of the Curtis Park house until the court issues a ruling, requesting to void the instrument for the allegedly forged quitclaim, recording a lease pendens notice of the lawsuit on the parcel so that anyone who intends to meddle has to stop, requesting the appointment of independent counsel for her and an additional capacity evaluation by a geriatric physician, together with an order to show cause and a hearing date on the preliminary injunction. I silently said a short sentence like a breath. The law is a heartbeat if we put the right words in the right places. Tonight, each word is lifting the roof of the house out of the storm. On Shannon's wooden table, under the cool light of a clamp lamp, she signed the affidavit, attached the body cam clip, and opened the notary journal to the page with the line she had written that evening. Refused, undue influence. The thumbprint box, where there should have been an inked fingerprint of the signer for a deed of transfer, was completely blank. Shannon looked straight into the camera, speaking slowly so as not to leave anything out. For house transfer documents, she is required to take a fingerprint in the journal. This file did not meet that requirement, so she refused. I saw a blank line suddenly become a high fence around the whole house, a white space that had saved an entire life story. In the recorder's office, the scanner hummed like steady rain. Ben pulled the indexing packet for the recorded quitclaim and pointed to 3 spots. The notarization certificate bore the commission number of a notary whose commission had expired the year before. The stamp was crooked. The font on the seal was not the standard one, and the recording timestamp fell after the commission's expiration date. He printed it out and set it in front of Aranda. These 3 points, taken together, make this an invalid instrument. Here, the ink tells the truth, even if the hand lies. I nodded, adding another line to my notebook. Ink does not know how to collude. The digital forensics room glowed blue with screens. Detective Alvarez held the freshly signed search warrant while the tech team opened Rick's phone. A PDF draft of the deed, its metadata matching exactly the night he applied pressure. A Photoshop file with a stamp layer recycled from an old image, a string of threatening text messages, and a voicemail in a lowered voice. Sign it, once, and it's done. Alvarez read out each item in the seizure report clearly, ending with a sentence like a padlock snapping shut. The chain of digital evidence is preserved from collection to the lab. I stood beside him and saw the truth appear like a photo with the brightness turned up. It had always been there. It was just now that someone turned on the light. The next morning, the white coat of the geriatric doctor spread a patch of calm across the exam room. I received the note. A memory test score of 2230. Conclusion. On the day Rick brought the papers, Dot did not have sufficient capacity to understand and consent to a complex house transfer transaction. The doctor spoke gently, hurting no one. Her ability to understand, remember, and weigh consequences at that time was not sufficient. I heard those two words, not sufficient, and felt myself settle, because justice needs sentences that precise in order to stand upright. On the front porch, in the quiet afternoon, the neighbors came by to be witnesses. Aranda drafted two declarations, one about limited capacity and one about signs of undue influence. My mother, Elaine, signed with a still shaking hand, but her strokes were decisive. I saw my mother bewildered. He shoved the pen into her hand. Mrs. Patel stood beside her, adding the timeline and Rick's raised voice attitude. I looked at both women and thought, witnesses are mirrors for the conscience, and that day they reflected it straight on. The long table covered in green felt appeared like a small stage for neatness. Aranda gathered everything into one stack of exhibits, labeling them from A to G. Shannon's video. The notary journal page with the word refused. The recorder's file. The data from Rick's phone. The geriatric doctor. The witnesses. Each one by itself could not stand alone, but together they were heavy enough to hold up a roof. The music in my head swelled. Aranda hit submit on the e-filing portal. The printer spit out the confirmation page, and the ink was still warm in my hand. I held my breath, and then let it go. We were not fighting. We were filing, and letting the law do the rest. Then came a short stretch of recovery. I set up the doorbell camera, replaced the lock with a smart lock, and hung a small note inside. Legal representative, Aranda Law. Contact if needed. Dot practiced memory exercises with a set of colored cards, naming objects, telling the year she moved to Curtis Park. My mother made lemon tea, the thin steam like a thread tying everyone back to their seats. I read the safety plan out loud to the whole family. Hotline numbers, contact people, how to answer when someone comes asking for a signature. Alvarez reminded us of the abuse report hotline. Ben texted, "Lease pendens is recorded. Anyone who tries to sell will run into stakes." Shannon scanned the entire journal page and clipped to the cloud. Recovery, I learned, is small tasks repeated every day. Each small task a brick paving the path back home. In my mind, the frame suddenly split into four. Aranda setting dates and printing subpoenas. Alvarez sealing evidence into silver bags, signing across the tape. Ben stamping the file, the seal coming down with a thump like a drumbeat. Shannon sliding the USB into an anti-static pouch, labeling it with date and time. My phone buzzed. A notification from the court. Ex parte hearing tomorrow morning. Judge McAllister. I looked at the words on the screen and felt that all the pieces had enough weight. The rest would be to lay them on the table, under the cold lights of the courtroom, where the air conditioner hums and the gavel strikes very softly, but enough to give an elderly person back the right to live in the house that bears her name. I turned off the light, pulled the blanket up over Dot, and spoke softly, like a promise. Tomorrow, we will carry the truth through the courthouse doors, by paperwork and by slow breathing. The Delta breeze slipped through again, carrying the smell of fresh lemon peel. I knew I was standing in the right place, beside her, on the threshold, in the middle of evidence that had already been brought into the light. Morning at the Sacramento Superior Court opened like a library, the air conditioning humming, cold lights, wooden benches echoing with the soft sound of shoes touching. The ex parte hearing was open to the public, the hallway speckled with coats, a few Curtis Park neighbors sitting huddled together as if they wanted to hold on to one roof with their eyes. I sat in the third row, clutching the file folder to my chest, smelling the familiar disinfectant of the hospital mixed with old wood, both scents evoking the feeling of caretaking. Judge McAllister nodded slightly. Attorney Aranda plugged in the USB, and the room suddenly grew so quiet you could hear the wall clock. The screen showed a frame I had watched many times, but that still made my throat tighten. Shannon, the mobile notary, sitting at Dot's eye level, her voice slow, explaining the procedure, while Rick occasionally slipped into the frame, his shadow falling over her shoulder like a cloud in the wrong season. "Can you say again what quitclaim means?" Shannon asked. Dot faltered. "Sign to fix the roof?" An answer so thin it could not possibly support a deed transferring the house. When the testimony began, Shannon stood with her back straight, her voice clear and gentle, exactly as in the video. She spoke about rules that were simple and solid like a door latch. For house transfer documents, the notary is required to take a thumbprint in the journal. Without it, the transaction cannot proceed safely. That night, she refused, because Dot did not understand the contents, and because her notary journal had no completed entry for this document. I looked down at my own hands, remembering the blank thumbprint box, a white space that had shielded the entire house. Then it was Ben's turn, from the county recorder's office. He presented black and white printouts, pointing to each detail that laypeople rarely notice. The notary certificate number on the quitclaim had been recorded as expired since the year before. The seal was off font. The edges of the letters blurred. The recording timestamp fell past the permitted date. Without big legal jargon, he spoke in the language of ink. "This is a sham instrument, using an expired commission." I caught a glimpse of the judge leaning in to look more closely. In the room quiet as a lake surface, the ink mark suddenly turned into the sound of stones thrown into water, clear, round, undisputed. Detective Alvarez from the police department took the stand last. He briefly described the part where the truth lit up. The search warrant on Rick's phone yielded a PDF draft of the deed matching the night of pressure. A Photoshop file with a stamp layer spliced from an old image. A string of threatening texts. "Sign it or else." And a lowered voicemail pushing, "Once, and it's done." Listening, I remembered the evening we changed the back lock, the feeling of standing outside my own door, both cold and wide awake. Alvarez closed with a sentence dry as a ballpoint stroke. The digital chain of evidence had been preserved intact, from seizure to the lab. I suddenly felt calm. When the path of the evidence is clear, the way home for the house itself draws nearer. Attorney Aranda gathered everything together like tying a bundle of reeds, requesting a temporary restraining order to protect Dot from coercion, requesting a freeze on all transactions involving the Curtis Park house, requesting that the suspect quitclaim be voided, recording Elias pendants on the parcel so anyone planning to sell has to stop, requesting that the court appoint independent counsel for her and order a new capacity evaluation by a geriatric physician. Each request was a stake driven into the ground, tied into the safety rope stretched over the roof. I looked over at my mother Elaine, her hand gripping the cloth bag handle, her eyes red but no longer panicked, and thought, sometimes loving means learning to call everything by its right name so the law can hear it. Judge McAllister flipped back through the printouts. Watch the clip of Shannon refusing to notarize one more time. When he looked up, the room seemed to take a collective breath. I heard my own breathing. 4 counts in, 6 counts out, just as I had practiced for weeks. The court takes note. he said, his voice as even as the wood surface of the bench. He began to read the lines that would change the air inside the Curtis Park house. The lines I had imagined since that rainy night on the porch. Protecting the most vulnerable by stopping, preserving, and shining light. I closed my eyes for half a second, opened them in time to see the light from the window fall across the evidence table like a white scarf. The neighbors nodded slightly. I tightened my grip on the folder and felt my back straighten. Even though there were still steps ahead, I knew the most important thing had just happened before my eyes. The truth had been set on the table, in public, and listened to. From here, we could move forward, slowly, clearly, calling by its right name the thing that needed to be kept, a roof, and the voice of the person who lived under it. The sound of the gavel was very soft, but the words that followed fell like stakes holding the roof against the wind. Judge McAllister looked over the rows of seats and then read the ruling, his voice even like the wood surface of the bench. The court grants a temporary restraining order for elder abuse. From this moment, Rick must be separated from Ms. Dot and from the Curtis Park house, with the police to enforce it immediately. I heard the clerk's pen underline each line, the rustle of pages turning softly, like the rhythm of breathing returning to normal. Next, he temporarily voided the effect of the quitclaim deed that had slipped into the record, and at the same time issued an order to show cause, setting a hearing on the preliminary injunction. He recorded a notice of pending action, lease pendens, on the parcel so that anyone planning a transfer would hit this very stake and stop. The air in the courtroom changed tone, like when thin clouds part to reveal a narrow band of sunlight. The judge added more, spelling out each point so no one could mishear. Appointing independent counsel for Ms. Dot if needed, and requiring an additional capacity evaluation by a physician or clinical psychologist. He authorized the initiation of a cancellation of instrument proceeding and, while the case is pending, absolutely prohibited any transfer, lease, encumbrance of the house. I looked down at the table, the exhibits labeled A through G, and saw all the pieces from the night before suddenly light up at once, like when you flip the right switch in a room you know by heart. Rick sprang to his feet, stammering, "I just wanted to fix the roof." The judge tilted his head, calm as a door latch set correctly into its slot. "You do not fix the roof with coercion, with a sham deed, and with a notary commission that has expired." That sentence landed without any raised voice, yet everyone heard that the boundary had just been redrawn very clearly. When the hearing ended, the bailiff gathered the files, and a deputy came over to hand Rick the TRO, briefly explaining the scope of the no-contact order and how it would be enforced. Out in the hallway, I saw a text from Ben. The LIS pendens had been recorded. The recorder's office would flag the file to block any transaction. Shannon came over to me, resting her hand lightly on the folder, her smile not flaunting victory, but order. My mother Elaine exhaled a long breath as if she had just set down a bag that was too heavy. Her hand shook less as she held her cup of water. We went with Aranda to the clerk's counter to get a stamped copy. He reminded us of the date for the preliminary injunction hearing and the list of things still to do. Serve the order on the local police station, send a copy to Adult Protective Services, schedule the capacity evaluation for Dot. It all sounded like a household to-do list, sweeping the porch, replacing the weather stripping, but each task was a cross brace holding up the roof. By noon, the Delta breeze had cleared the sky. Back in Curtis Park, the deputy taped the restraining order to the inside of the door and showed my mother the emergency number to call if it was violated. I changed the smart lock code, updated the list of people allowed into the house, and reinstalled the doorbell camera. Dot sat at the table and I poured lemon tea. She asked softly, "We still live here, right?" I nodded. sliding the file folder toward her like pushing over a pillow. "You live in your own house." She smiled, eyes wet but light. The smile of someone who has just heard her name read correctly in a ledger. I texted Shannon to thank her that "I refuse" had been heard by the court. Texted Ben to thank him for the ink marks that spoke. Sent Alvarez the list of upgraded cameras. In the afternoon, I wrote a few lines in my notebook. Today, the roof was held up by paperwork, but warmed back up by people. I thought of those walking the courthouse halls with folders clutched to their chests. I wish they each had a Shannon patient enough, a Ben who could spot a crooked letter, an Aranda who typed the wording just right, an Alvarez who lit up the traces, and a judge calm enough to drive the stakes into the right place. If you are hearing this story somewhere between the lemon tree breeze and the soft sound of trains in Sacramento, I want you to remember the 4 words that saved us: slow, clear, enough, bright. Slow so the weakest person has time to understand. Clear so the strongest cannot slip through. Enough so the law can stand firm. And bright so the truth can be seen. Tonight, I will tape one more small note behind the door. Home is where voices are respected. Then I will make tea, sit beside Dot, and tell her about that morning, using the most ordinary voice, because justice has done its part. And we will go on with ours, living in peace in the very house that bears our name. 2 weeks later, we went back to court on a morning brighter than the last time. The hallway still smelled of old wood and disinfectant, but I felt myself breathing deep, even and slow, as if I had learned how to walk through this place without shaking. The file was thicker and tidier, Shannon's body cam clip on top, followed by the page from her notary journal with the line, "Refused undue influence," and the fingerprint box left blank. The new capacity evaluation from the geriatric doctor, clearly stating that on the day Rick brought the paper, Dot was not able to understand and weigh the consequences. The packet from the county recorder's office with the filing timestamp, fee, recorded instrument, and the details of the mismatched seal font. The digital forensics report from Rick's phone, draft transfer file, a seal layer copied from an old image, the edit history, and finally the lowered voice voicemail, "Sign it or else." Attorney Aranda just rested his hand on the stack and gave me a slight nod. I understood. Everything was now standing on the same side. The hearing on the preliminary injunction was consolidated with the earlier motions, so that all the pieces could be examined under one light. Judge McAllister rewatched Shannon's clip, where she patiently explained each word while Rick kept cutting in, where Dot hesitated and asked, "Sign so we can fix the roof?" He read through the notary journal page with the empty fingerprint box and looked up to reconfirm the mandatory procedure. Listened to the doctor briefly present the memory scores and the capacity conclusion. Looked at the recorder's packet with the notary certificate number that had already expired, then heard Detective Alvarez speak about the path of the data, the draft file, the seal layer, and the string of threatening messages. My mother gripped the cloth handle of her tote, and I kept my eyes on the bold line on the folder cover. Curtis Park, 1979. When it came time for the ruling, the judge's voice laid each brick in a straight line. He voided the quitclaim deed for 2 core reasons: lack of capacity at the time of signing and undue influence. He issued a civil order canceling the instrument under the law governing the nullification of faulty documents, so that paper would have no chance to come back through another door. He granted an elder abuse restraining order for 5 years, defining the scope of no contact and communication, and assigned enforcement to the appropriate agency. And then, after stitching together ink marks, frames, and digital files, he concluded there was probable cause to refer the matter to the district attorney's office for them to consider charges related to recording a false deed, elder abuse, and forgery. Without raising his voice, he simply said, "A home is where the weakest person still gets to hear their own voice." I did not look at Rick. I looked at Dot. She sat a little straighter, as if the wooden chair beneath her had just been shimmed to the right height. Ben texted Aranda. "Lee's pendants remains. The recorder has flagged the record to block any transfer." Shannon sent me confirmation that the clip and the digitized notary journal had been filed. Detective Alvarez set a date to pull additional copies from the newly installed doorbell camera. Everything continued like a household to-do list, serving the order on the local police station, locking in the follow-up geriatric appointment, updating who is allowed into the house, taping the hotline number behind the door. Leaving the courthouse, the Delta breeze was so gentle it sounded like someone lightly blowing dust off a step. My mother said, "One leg of the journey done," and I nodded. In truth, it wasn't done. It was put back where it belonged. Her name, her right to live there, and the boundary around a roof. That afternoon, I made lemon tea and read the important lines aloud to her in the most ordinary voice. That paper had been canceled, the restraining order was in effect for many years, and the rest, if anything remained, had been sent to where it needed to be handled. She laid her hand on the smooth tabletop and smiled. "We're still in our own house." I smiled too, feeling a stretch of light open inside my chest. That evening, I taped one more small note at the entrance. "This house respects the voices of the elderly." Not a challenge, just a reminder. I texted thanks to Aranda, Shannon, Ben, Alvarez. Each of them a strand that had held the roof tight these past weeks. And if anyone asks what I learned, I will tell them the 4 words that saved us. Slow, clear, enough, bright. Slow so there's time to explain. Clear so no one can slip through. Enough so it all stands firm. Bright so the truth can be seen. The rest is our work of going on. Making tea, taping up the medication schedule, opening the windows to let the wind pass through, and calling by their right names the things that belong to us. Justice is not a sweet taste. It is the clean taste of ledgers and recordings. The thin gold of the afternoon lays over the Curtis Park bungalows, the Delta breeze carrying the scent of fresh lemon peel. Dot stands on the wooden porch, watering the small lemon tree by the steps, her hand slow as if watering her own memories again. My mother, Elaine, comes closer, takes my hand, her voice trembling but clear. "I'm sorry. There were times I let someone else speak in place of our own house's voice." I nod, not blaming. In every family there is a moment when we fall out of step. What matters is coming back to the right rhythm, calling by their right names the things that must be kept. I stick one more small paper behind the door. Home is where the voices of the elderly are respected. Looking at that line, I see the room brighten by half a shade. In the soft stillness of the afternoon, I remind myself of the lesson of these past weeks. Slow, clear, enough, bright. Slow so the weakest person has time to understand. Clear so the strongest cannot slip through. Enough so we can stand firm against the wind. And bright so the truth can be seen. Because sometimes an entire roof is kept not by shouting but by a frame, played at the right moment, and a line of words written in the right place. Best revenge is following procedure correctly from the first minute. One body-worn camera speaks for a whole house. One notary journal saves an entire lifetime. I hold Dot's hand, hear the steady sound of water pouring from the watering can, hear my mother exhale more deeply, and know that peace is not loud. It only stays when boundaries are put back in their proper place. If this story touches you, stay with us. Share so that one more home can be protected. so that one more voice is not pushed down by haste and fear. Have you ever seen someone pressure an elderly person into signing papers? Comment SAC if you're watching from Sacramento. Like, subscribe, share, so that every home is protected by the law.